privilege today to sit down with Ray Aldred, who is the Director of Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology and is passionate about empowering people of faith to learn better cross-cultural communication, specifically with Canada's First Peoples. Ray, thank you so much for joining me.
It's good to be here.
So now when you talk about learning better cross-cultural communication, what are you talking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about learning to three things. One is that you got to set aside your judgment because not everybody thinks the way that a person thinks according to one's culture that they grew up in. So when you're trying to have a conversation about anything with someone from another culture, they didn't grow up in your culture, so they may have other categories. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking about setting aside, you got to set aside your ideas about what's judging, what is appropriate, what's funny, what's all those kinds of judgments. You just set it aside for a while to just try to understand and to communicate and to speak from the heart.
So set aside judgment. You said three things. Set aside judgment.
Set aside judgment. You got to put whatever you're saying into their categories of what you're trying to say.
So kind of learn to speak their language as opposed to expect them to learn to speak yours.
Right. And if you're talking about Christian cross-cultural communication, the third thing is that it's the Spirit who somehow mediates the relationship between us. And in fact, Indigenous folks too believe that somehow Creator does something that enables us to connect, even across cultures, even across languages. You see that in a powwow, when they sing the intertribal songs, those are all vocables. Everybody dances from every nation, and you can sing them, and every nation can sing them.
So how does Christianity change when it's filtered through Indigenous culture? How does the theology change even?
You mean if it becomes Indigenous?
Yeah.
Well, it did become Indigenous. It's just that when early missionaries came, many times Indigenous people received the gospel. A lot of the children who went to residential school were baptized into the Christian church before they came there. A lot of times the abuse that the residential schools did to Indigenous children was against children who were part of the church. But they didn't like how it looked. They wanted Indigenous children to look and talk and act like with European values. They were trying to be a nation state, like European nation states, I guess. So they thought they needed to destroy. There's a famous quote that the church would Christianize and the government would civilize, and this would transform Indigenous culture into people able to be part of this growing nation state of Canada.
And that's really hurt our message, hasn't it? I mean, in terms of trying to me as a white person, ever broach Christianity with somebody who has a legacy of residential schools, either for themselves or their family, it's almost impossible, isn't it?
Right. I find that most people are okay with Jesus, it's just the church they don't like. And I think sometimes the church has a hard time admitting that they made mistakes and they don't know how to walk in repentance. They're good at telling other people how to do that, just not good at doing it themselves.
What can we do? I know that many church organizations have apologized, they've given money. There has, obviously some steps been taken, but what can we do to heal some of those wounds, or what are some steps we can take?
I think that every person should take personal responsibility for what happened in the residential schools and the programs that were aimed at cultural genocide, and people should take personal responsibility and work to begin to heal the damaged relationships that were the result of that. In saying that, I'm not trying to make people feel guilty. I think that Christ pays for sin and that we can embrace forgiveness. So this isn't an issue for me. When I say responsibility, I don't mean that people feel guilty. I'm talking about that you would use responsibility as a way to live differently, that we would live differently because we take seriously what happened, and we try to begin to heal the best that we can the relationships that are damaged. And then we do it on an individual basis, because unless we do that, then these things just keep happening again and again and again.
I think that word of responsibility is tough sometimes, because just even taking myself, I understand it as a spiritual principle because I know what I represent. But at the same time, I never ran residential schools. I don't want to have that happen. I hate the fact that it happened personally, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, how can I take responsibility? I didn't do it to you, Ray, you know, or to your family.
Right.
But at the same time, I know that when people see me, they don't just see me. They see what I represent. And there's a whole history that comes with me.
Right. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was martyred for his faith during the Second World War, he wrote, once you don't have to prove your innocence anymore, or if you give up having to prove your innocence, then you can take responsibility for the sins of society and begin to work to heal those things. So one of the cool things about the gospel and forgiveness is that we can just embrace that, yeah, we're guilty.